The lesson for today is from Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. And while he was saying this, a cloud came down and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things that they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, some of you may have heard the story of the little girl from the big city who went to visit her grandmother in the country. One evening they sat outside and were enjoying the panorama of the stars in the heavens. Such sparkling brilliance the little girl had never seen, having grown up with the city and with all of its lights. In complete awe and beauty of that moment, she turned to her grandmother and said, "If heaven is so beautiful on the wrong side, what must it be like on the right side?" Well, in our gospel lesson, Jesus was getting closer to Jerusalem. All that was wrong with the world would soon come crashing down on his life with all of its brutality, its suffering, its heartache, its vengeance. So what does Jesus do? He goes up on a mountain to pray. And there he is transfigured. Trans is the Latin word for across. So whether we transfigure or transcend or transform, we move across one boundary to another. And on this Transfiguration Sunday, we remember how God allowed mortal creatures who still lived within the boundaries of time and space to move across a threshold, to experience that veil between heaven and earth being lifted. 2 worlds that come together for this brief moment. 2 worlds that couldn't be farther apart, but 2 worlds that are so much closer than we could ever imagine. Well, our gospel for today, the Transfiguration story, isn't the only one in the Bible. We see it happening in the Old Testament too, in the story of Exodus, of long ago, when Moses crossed a boundary that no one ever thought possible, right into the very presence of God. A God considered so holy that entering into God's presence meant certain death. Do you remember it? The Lord said to Moses, "Moses, come up to me on the mountain." And when the people below looked up at the mountain, a cloud had descended on it, and it radiated with this heavenly light so brilliant that it looked more like a fire ready to devour anyone who came near. But up on the mountain Moses went, right into the cloud, disappearing into that devouring fire. And many thought that Moses was a goner. 40 days and 40 nights felt like a lifetime, like a generation had come and gone. And many had given up any kind of hope for Moses. That is, until the day that Moses came down with the law in his hands, his face as radiant as the sun from being in the presence of God. And so bright was this light shining from Moses' face that he had to put a veil over it as he addressed God's people. Transfiguration. Moses had crossed a boundary into the very presence of God and lived. Well, our gospel for today is really a continuation of this miraculous story as Jesus, who was nearing his passion in Jerusalem, took Peter and James and John up on a mountain to pray. And suddenly a cloud rolled in, enshrouding them, and a brilliant heavenly light changed their appearance. And when Peter and James and John looked up, there was Moses, Elijah, and Jesus visiting like old friends who had known each other for a very long time. Peter must have had a similar thought as that little girl who felt so overwhelmed that night that she looked up into the glorious night. Yes, if heaven can look so beautiful on the wrong side, what must it look like on the right side? So overjoyed was Peter that he wanted to tabernacle it, like he and his family did during the Feast of Tabernacles that Peter had experienced every year growing up when he was a boy. It was a time when life was carefree and fun, days when he and his dad would work side by side to prepare for that great celebration that lasted 7 days, a whole week, with every seventh year designated for a public reading of the law handed down to them by Moses. Well, the Feast of Tabernacles was a time when dads and moms and kids would traditionally go out together and cut and gather branches from the trees in their little village. The boughs themselves a symbol of life and all things good that God had bestowed on their lives, like home and harvest, like the love that they celebrated within their family and the gift of community, and the sun and the moon and the stars in that heavenly host that shone down on them, and above all, God's faithfulness to them in all things. From the gathered branches, they constructed a tabernacle, a temporary dwelling place made with the branches of those trees, where they would live for a week, just like their ancestors did when they journeyed with Moses from Egypt through the wilderness to Mount Sinai, and then on their journey to the Promised Land. Well, Mount Sinai was that great and holy place where Moses encountered God in the burning bush that did not burn, and where the great prophet Elijah would run for refuge when his life had been threatened. Mount Sinai was that sacred place of enlightenment where Elijah and Moses waited for a word from God that would light up the sky, that could thunder down from heaven, that shook them to the very marrow of their bones. Oh yes, for Peter that day on the mountain with Jesus and Moses and Elijah, well, it would conjure up all those boyish memories and feelings. They had crossed a threshold into the very presence of their heroes, of those they knew stories of from long ago. And so to prolong it, Peter told Jesus that he was willing to build 3 tabernacles, 3 temporary shelters, just like he did when he was a kid. They could spend a week there, or as much time as they wanted. Heck, for all he cared, they could spend an eternity there. But then as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The dazzling apparel, the cloud that had descended, the thunderous declaration from God, "This is my son, my chosen, listen to him." All of it dissipated, disappeared, and fell into the backdrop of silence and darkness, and a quick descent back down the mountain. As quickly as it came, it was gone. But oh, it was a good day. It was a very, very good day. Well, we all have our good days and our bad days. And when the days are good, it's easy to believe that there's a loving God who is for us. When a day is very, very good, like Peter, we may even want to prolong it. We might say, "I wish this day could go on forever." But we know it won't. And having said it, almost takes some of the joy out of the moment, because we are reminded of all those places we'd rather forget, those places that make us feel angry at ourselves and at the world and at God. Days that have left us questioning whether there is a God at all. Well, the poet Gerhard Frost once recalled this conversation between a little 7-year-old boy and his grandmother. "Grandma," the little boy asked. "Yes," she replied. "Oh, Grandma, it's been a bad day, a really, really bad day. I lost my friend, and the teacher made me sit by myself because she thought I talked too much. So on my way home, I made a snowball, and I threw it, and I told God that I hope it hit him right in the heart. But after a while, I told God I was sorry, and then things got a little better." Then Gerhard Frost wrote, "I too have made my own snowball and thrown it at God. But I also have heard the good news, and I believe there is more than power and intelligence behind this world. There is love, there is heart. Everything happening on this broken planet with its battered children hits God right in the heart." Can you relate? Have you ever wanted to throw a snowball at God? Well, God's answer is, "I know, dear child, I've been there too." All we have to do is look at the life of our Lord to know the truth of that. And then it dawns on us. That is exactly why Jesus came. He who crossed the threshold from heaven to earth to be the bridge between the unholy and the holy, so that like Moses, we too can hear that good news. I stood in the presence of God and lived. Yes, if heaven can be so beautiful on the wrong side, what must it look like on the right side? Well, in Jesus, we have a sacred place where we can go to both celebrate those very, very bad days, and where we can go with all of our anger and hopelessness and sorrow, and know that we are never alone. That place is Jesus and his cross. That hideous moment in which the world would hurl all of its hate and anger at God. But that it is also a place where we can come to know that God is not just some deity who sits up in all of heaven's glory, building a tabernacle around God's self, to insulate God from all the pain and the brokenness and the sin of this world. Instead, God chooses to cross that threshold to be with us in all things, embracing the bad with the good. Jesus and his cross is also a reminder that God has also had a very, very bad day. It is where Gerhard Frost says, everything happening on our broken planet with its battered children hits God right in the heart. Yes, Jesus embraces all the good and all the bad in our world because he embraces you and me, and then enters into suffering and death to save us, to pave the way to heaven in all of its glory. And so God proclaims to Peter and to James and to John, just before they descend down into the world with all of its problems and heartache and sin and death, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." Well, I believe that's the truth of the Transfiguration. For a blissful moment, God simply lifted the veil between heaven and earth to show us how far apart and yet how near are those two worlds. And he embraces them both, the good and the bad, in his beloved Son, Jesus Christ, through his life and his death on the cross, being that very bridge that brings us all together again as we cross that threshold from the boundaries of the unholy to the holy, from the mortal to immortality, from death to everlasting life. Glory be to Christ. Amen.